Basically, what I will do today is present the latest paper I published on cities, but at the same time, I will have to connect that to prior pieces of research. So by all means, feel free to read the paper, but also to write me and ask me for other references. So basically what I'll do is I present the context of what is happening in terms of housing in Latin America. Then I will present a case study, and then we'll drive some conclusions from there. And in terms of context, this is just about being all in the same page. Basically, as you know, Latin America is highly urbanized and also is highly unequal in terms of how those cities provide services to different people in different places. And just to give you some very brief numbers, so you have that clear in terms of magnitude, about a third of residents who live in cities live in some informal settlement. And then in terms of demand for housing, that's 55 million people, that's a lot. And then 57 people work in the informal economy. And I hope that you recognize that there is a very clear link between this high level of informality in labor markets and this high level of informality in housing markets. Those two are very much related. And inequality is about the lack of access to the same services within the same city. So, it's kind of like having different entry points for the same problem. And now, there is something that I really want you to have clear when we talk about deficit, which is, in terms of housing, what kind of deficit are we talking about? So, what you see there is quantitative deficit, which means that, okay, the person, the family, the household who is living there needs a new shelter. That is not acceptable. That is not something that, we can say we will mend it. It is not considered, adequate in no measure, so you need a new place. And then the other option is that when you need a new unit, a new housing unit, is when you have two families or two households sharing the same roof. So those are the only two cases where the only solution basically is we need to have a new unit. Then you have what we call qualitative deficit. And qualitative deficit, which this is a very typical example, it means that the unit that you have is deficient in one particular aspect, in one or more. And that deficiency could be in terms of size. It's not big enough for the number of people that it is accommodating, and the standard is 3 people per room. Those standards are provided by UN Habitat and typically replicated in national census. You don't have a basic service. Like me, you don't have water, or you don't have sanitation, or you don't have electricity. And you don't have the titles. The tenure situation is iffy. There's something there that is not proper. But for example, in this case, there are some services you see here. And the materials are not the best, but the house will resist many things. So this is what qualitative looks like. Now, in terms of trying to understand how the magnitude of the demand and the type of demand of housing we see, this is more or less the distribution. So one thing to bear in mind is that the majority of the things that are making this huge number of housing deficit are related to infrastructure, which is typically something that the municipality should provide. And then tenure is another big thing, which is something that happens at the level of the city or the nation, depending on the legal framework. Now, that means that 94% of this deficit is of qualitative nature. Doesn't mean that you need to build a new house to solve it. And now this is the critical point. And this is replicated all over Latin America. We see this disproportion between qualitative deficit and the kind of response from the state for solving this deficit. This huge mismatch between having 90% of the subsidies going for building new units versus having almost 90% of the demand in terms of needing better units everywhere. We see this in Mexico, we see this in Brazil, we see this in Colombia, we see this in Argentina, we see this even in Chile. So this is everywhere. And I don't mention more countries just because I haven't studied those. I suspect it's the same case. So this is the outcome that you get. when you have all this amount of money going for building new units, when you have units that are degraded, but you do not upgrade those, typically you're going to be building this kind of thing, because you cannot build all those units in the city itself. So this is very much connected to where this is going to happen. So those big numbers that I've shown you, like the majority of the deficit is qualitative, the majority of the funding goes for quantitative. It's happening in Mexico too. You have this, like 93% of the people need to improve their current unit, yet, only 6% of the money goes for that purpose. It's a huge mismatch. And then that also creates issues in many fronts. Also, in cities where you get these type of situations, like housing units which are in disrepair in areas where there is already a city that surrounds them. And you have the outcome that we just have seen. Now, just to give you a sense, this is huge, particularly in Mexico. The government has set this huge target in terms of number of units. And, actually they deliver, and this keeps on going. The red is the amount of units for the lowest income as they define it in terms of access to housing. And the gray is the middle, but still low. And as you see, the number of units being built is huge. The stock is growing. But then when you think, where are those units, the location of those units, what you see is that, on one hand, it's impressive. A quarter of the stock has been built, in less than 15 years. And where have those been built? Really far from cities, like really far from downtown where most of the people work. So we are talking about 87% of those units building somewhere very far from downtown. And that's as you know well, that creates a lot of externalities also, on resources, natural resources. So now, this is that was the framework for Mexico, but then we did a specific case study on Puebla. And what I'm going to show here is not part of the cities paper, it's part of another paper that look at the side of the households. But I also thought it was interesting to bring it here. So basically what we did is we took two complexes, two social housing complexes that were targeting the same kind of customer, let's say, like same kind of households in terms of income, have the same rules for applying. And then basically the difference was that one was downtown, the other one was 20 kilometers from downtown. And what we did was asking residents, like 25, a sample of 25 in the central complex, the same amount in the peripheral, then the interviews to developers, that's what we'll talk most. And then we did a review of policy instruments. And what we wanted to know was that, one, which are the externalities on families of being there, and why this is happening. Like, why are these housing units being built where they are being built? So just, like very briefly, what you see is that, and we suspected this, I mean, this is no surprise, but still is, impressive to see it, in black and white, that the commuting was horrible. Like, people were spending 3 hours versus 1 hour daily for the basic commute, like not doing anything else than going to their jobs. And in terms of money, that was also huge. And we've seen the same numbers for Brazil as well. The only thing that's worth mentioning in the case of Brazil is that the bus had a flat fee, so it didn't impact so much in their expenditures. But in terms of the time that they were using for this commuting, in all the cases, it's very hard. And it's not just that the distance is a lot. These people depend on bus systems that are not well coordinated. So if you have your own car, maybe this will take you half the time. But if you have to be changing buses and walk 10 blocks and maybe, like take another thing, that will amount for a lot of time. Then in terms of property value, and we did not have a sufficient number of transactions. So this was based on the expectation. But the expectation for those who were having property in the periphery was that it decreased. So the property that they have now is less valuable than before they bought it, and the opposite in downtown. And this is the main thing, because the only reason why this is happening is to improve people, to increase their ability to capitalize and to be more prosperous. So this is not a minor thing. And then social interaction, we did not monetize this, but basically the question is like, how often do you see your family after you have moved? And for those who are living in the periphery, it was once a month. And we know that that creates a lot of externalities in terms of their networks, their ability to improve, in life, and also how was the case that before they could allocate certain services in their family, like for example, childcare or taking care of the ill people, and now everything depends on them, and that's also having a toll on these families. Now, this has a gender dimension, and it's related to what I just mentioned, that the majority of the households who were going to the periphery were led by women and were first-time home buyers. And it is unclear which consequences this will have, 10 years from now, in terms of, the lack of resources, social resources that are for these households, in terms of access to basic childcare or schools or even their ability to visit their parents who are likely to be older 10 years from now. Now we go to the developers, and what we found is that the developers who were developing in central areas were in general smaller, and they were very specialized. They did social housing in Puebla, for example. The developers who were developing in the outskirts, they were doing anything. They would do, an international hotel in Cozumel. They will do, fancy housing units somewhere in Mexico. They will do this. And it has to do with economies of scale as well. And we'll talk about this later. And, just to give you a sense of this, many of these companies, they are part of the New York City Stock Exchange. So we are talking about huge companies being part of this developing business in the periphery. And the other thing that was very interesting was about the cost structure, like in terms of how, when we asked them, if you have 100% of your investment, how you distribute it among these things. Oh, there is another line there, but basically it's land, infrastructure, labor, and materials. So this is the central complex, this is the peripheral complex. This is materials, it was about a third. This is labor, it was a third and a little bit more. And then this part is what is land plus infrastructure. And basically they were both spending the same as a proportion. The difference was that downtown, land was much more expensive, infrastructure was much easier on their accounting. The opposite in the periphery, like land was quite cheap, but then they had to invest on infrastructure. So this was not the answer why they were going to the periphery. Because the first thing one thinks is, okay, they're going to the periphery because it's cheaper, but not because land is cheaper. There is another source for them in terms of making that profitable. And it has to do with economies of scale. And that's why we see the largest companies there, because in order to get to economies of scale, you have to be building really huge number of units. So it's 500 plus. And if they get there, they have better prices everywhere. They have better prices with their contractors. They have like cheaper materials. And this was harder to discuss, but it was also the case. You have to imagine if you are a huge developer going to downtown, whatever, Puebla or Mexico, you are important, but you are not this, the only important one there. But if you're a huge developer going to a small municipality in the periphery, not only you get your labor cheaper because you are hiring so many people, you also have an easier time with the municipality, and that speeds up everything. And that's also part of the reason why they were preferring, building in these peripheries. And then this is their developers' rationale. But now I think we should go back to the very beginning and that mismatch between quantitative and qualitative. And what we see is that there is a fracture, not only in terms of the match between the type of deficit and the type of response, but also how the different levels of governments are being coordinated. So at the national level, what we see is the funding structure, which I just described. very briefly, and the standards for the housing unit. That's determined at the national level, so which is the minimum size, the minimum services, all that. And then municipal governments determine land use. That means where this type of housing could go, but they do not talk to each other. And even less, municipal governments, they do not talk among themselves. So you have all this, fractured landscape because, there is no metropolitan coordination. So just to summarize what we have seen and to draw some conclusions from there. So peripheral households, they have less initial capital. That's why you see women. Typically, their earning power is less, even within this bracket of low-income households. And they capitalize less. Not only they start, at a lower place, their speed, in terms of capitalizing is likely to, never catch up with downtown in as much as their expenditures, in times and money, their lack of networks, the value of their property are going, backwards. And developers, they have similar cost structures, and their gain is based on economies of scale, and I would say power asymmetries in terms of their ability to negotiate with local municipalities. And that's the kind of landscape you get. There's another whole conversation here in terms of the quality of these spaces. It's kind of a sad playground, And in terms of national policies, a mismatch between need and demand. And then some national policies, every municipality will draw social housing in the periphery, in the around periphery. But there is no coordination, so there is no coordination between where jobs are being created, where housing is being built, and that is creating externalities for everybody. And just to give you an idea, there have been so many houses that had been abandoned, like of this, when families start experiencing this huge toll on their daily lives, they just, abandon them. So in terms of what to do, I think that we have to do two things. One is like how you prevent this from happening in the future, and how you solve what already had happened. And both things are equally important. So in terms of proactive, no-brainer, match subsidies to demand, and support rental housing and improvement programs that will allow areas that have been deteriorated, where we already have infrastructure, to be occupied. Metropolitan planning and urban densities, two sides of the same thing. So how you allowed, the building of housing units in the existing urban grid, and as we have seen, developers are indifferent. They will build wherever they are allowed to build. It's not that they have any problem in building downtown. It's just that it's more profitable for them building the periphery. And then, if we limit the maximum size of these housing complexes, we will have not this incentive for going so big, and building so many. And then in terms of reactive, what do we do with all this that has been built? Something has to be done. So we have to create a system where these housing complexes can become cities, can become real places, and that has to do a lot with jobs. It's not just about beautification. Then transport connections, as I said, it is often the case that is not that it's so far, but there is no clear connection, and also, especially for mothers, that's a huge thing, if they have to find where to leave the kid and then take another bus and walk 10 blocks, that's kind of very complicated. Public spaces, there are no public spaces, sometimes are a joke, if they are. The legal processes, that's another issue, like if we have abandoned houses, how do we deal with those? And the whole environmental performance, that's another chapter, but just to let you know, many of those places are very floodable, so that's a whole other issue. So I think that's it. Thank you.